The reason I say political participation is because there's many more things we can do besides just vote. For example, while voting is the most common way we can be a part of an election campaign, we can help. Maybe some of you have parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles who like to put up signs for someone running on a local level, put up election signs in the county. Is that in the class I'm hearing?
Yeah, it's out in the hallway. They're just being really loud.
Okay, okay. Let me make this a little bigger too. We can contact our public officials. Somewhere I've got a letter that I received back from President Clinton back when he was president. I'll have to try to dig it out. My son, Obama's first election was in 2008. So my son was 10, and he wrote President Obama, and he got a letter back from him. I'll have to see if I can dig that out too. So you can contact your public officials. And it's a lot easier nowadays. You can find their personal websites, get their email, and a lot faster than snail mail. You can join an interest group or support an interest group financially. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, for example, is an interest group. And then when it says unconventional political acts, this usually is referring to extreme measures and sometimes violence. We're certainly living in a time where our nation is very, very tense right now, and we're seeing more and more physical altercations. Excuse me. But voting still remains the most common form of participation. When we talk about political participation, it's simply any activity with the intent of influencing our government or policy. So that's what we're talking about here. So we're going to focus on, since it's the most common form, we're going to focus on voting for a little bit. This is the first half of chapter 7. And just a little overview of the history of voting rights in our country. Even before the early 1800s, and especially before the 1800s, the federal government left it up to the states to decide who could vote in each state. Most states only allowed male property owners to vote. And of course, back then, it would have been white male property owners. Now, when you see religious here, that probably is more on the local level. Communities might have put some restrictions as far as, for example, if it's, let's say in Massachusetts, where it was founded as a Puritan colony, and if you're a Catholic living there, you might not be able to vote because of your religion. You had to pay so many taxes. So there were certain requirements before the early 1800s that were then eliminated. In 1870, the 15th Amendment is passed, and we're going to look at these three things right now: the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendment. The 15th Amendment and this is the third amendment that's called the Reconstruction Amendments, along with the 13th, 14th, and 15th. This amendment basically, in theory, allowed people of color and people who used to be servants, so we're talking about slaves. This amendment gave them, again, in theory, the right to be able to vote. Approved in 1870. Now, Southern society still found ways to get around this amendment. For example, they would require you, in order to vote, you would have to pass a literacy test. And many of the African Americans who had been freed did not have any kind of education except for what they received in their churches, usually. A few of them might have had some African American schools that they were able to attend, but so they made these literacy tests very hard. And even those who gave the tests sometimes had to look up the answers. So they were very difficult tests that very few African Americans could pass. And I think even in Mississippi, and this is mentioned in the textbook, only 1 out of 25 African Americans were eligible to vote. So a very, very low African American voter turnout or eligibility at that time. Then another thing they did to try to get around this amendment was, okay, if you were able to pass the test, you then had to sign your name, and then the election officials would make sure all those who passed, your names would then be published in the newspaper as, quote, troublemakers, just because you passed the literacy test. You were considered a troublemaker because you wanted to exercise your 15th Amendment right to vote. And we know that the Southern society, the Southern states, continued to do these things for years. And then they had Jim Crow laws, and it wasn't until the Civil Rights passage that those things were kind of finally done away with. There's a movie from 1988 based on 3 young men who were in Mississippi, 3 men from Chicago who had gone down to Mississippi in, I believe, around 64, 65, and they went down to Mississippi to help African Americans register to vote, because African Americans were still intimidated in Mississippi. Those 3 white boys were murdered and buried in a dam embankment. And the movie's called Mississippi Burning. And while it's not completely historically accurate, it kind of gives you a sense of how even still in the 1960s, there was still intimidation by the majority whites to keep African Americans from registering to vote. So 15th Amendment in 1870. Any questions?
No.
About 50 years later, well, exactly 50 years later, the 19th Amendment is passed, giving women the right to vote. Up until this time, and even after this time, and probably still find some pockets of society that still have this belief that their place was to be in the home, not in the public sphere. So um, women who championed the right to vote were called suffragettes. The word suffrage means simply the right to vote. So they were working to gain suffrage for women. So they were called suffragettes. And you can see this was a battle going on also at the same time in England, not just here in the United States. So if you think about it, next year, in 2016 we had our first. Well, Hillary ran against Obama in 2008 for the Democratic nomination, but lost. But she was the Democratic nominee in 2016, the first woman to be a presidential candidate on a ticket. In 2020, we're going to have several women from the Democratic Party trying to get the nomination. And so think about how far we've come in 100 years from women first getting the right to vote, just to vote, now running for the highest office in our nation. And I'm sure it's even more, I don't know, probably blows your mind more than mine, since you guys have always lived in a time where women have been a part of politics, been senators, governors, you guys lived through 8 years of Mary Fallon as our governor. So, and there were several women governors. So I'm sure it's more of a, oh, sorry guys, somebody's at my door. Let's take a quick break. So I'm sure for you to think about just 100 years and since women could start voting, it's pretty amazing to think about. Any questions on the women, the amendment for women getting the right to vote? The next amendment is the 26th Amendment, and it came about also 50 years later in 1971. This came about because of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had been raging all through the 60s, and it came up that because at this time you had to be 21 to vote. And since there was still the draft, the draft was still in effect at that time, and if you were 18 or older, you could be conscripted into the military forces at any time, especially during the Vietnam War. People started saying, look, if these people, these young men especially, mostly, if they're old enough to fight a war, they're old enough to vote. And so that was the impetus for the 26th Amendment, that it dropped the voting age from 21 to 18 years. So you'll notice this was around 71, 50 years after the 19th Amendment, which was 50 years after the 15th Amendment. And so we're at about another 50-year cycle with the 2020 election coming up. And wouldn't you know it, that there are some Democrats, I think Elizabeth Warren is one of them, who is pushing now to lower the voting age to 16. So that'll be interesting to see if that gets put on the ballot. What are your thoughts as 16, 17-year-olds? Do you think 16-year-olds should be able to vote?
No.
Interesting. What would be some reasons why?
I feel like too many like opinions used for
Okay, one at a time.
Like too many opinions, like personal opinions. For 16-year-olds.
Too many personal opinions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think they're not old enough yet. Yeah, sure.
You're not educated on all the topics it involves.
It's what?
You're uneducated on all the topics that you need to be educated about.
They can be convinced too much about false information.
Yeah.
Not educated enough. What'd you say, Connor?
I guess they'd be too gullible about other people's opinions.
Oh, okay. Okay. Easily swayed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Some people might argue, well, if you're old enough to operate a motor vehicle, you should be old enough to vote. I'm just bringing that up. I don't know if that's really an argument.
Yeah. Don't say that really correlates, but.
Ow.
Are you comfortable with 18 being the entry age?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Legally, you're an adult.
Yes, legally you're an adult.
All right. So any questions on the kind of the history of voting participation in the United States?
I don't think so.
For the test, know these three amendments, 15th, 19th, and 26th, and what they secured.
15, 19.
So now we want to turn to voter turnout. As we continue to talk about voter participation, or the way that you can, the most popular way that people participate is voting. Let's talk about voter turnout. This little cartoon is a good representation. You know, the line to vote is very short. The line to not vote, which, you know, of course, there's not a line, but it's just illustrating how many of our eligible voters do not vote. Now, this was an interesting statistic that I wanted to show, because we're going to talk about reasons why voter turnout is lower in the United States than many other democracies. And one thing that they mentioned is that in some states in the United States, you can actually register the day you vote. In other words, you can go in to vote, and if you're not registered, you can register right there on the spot. And so you can see that this has been, since 1980, these states have consistently and continually been higher than states where you cannot vote on the same day. I think Oklahoma, I'm pretty sure you have to register 2 weeks before an election in Oklahoma. So we're one of these states down here. Now, some people do not vote because they don't want to register. They don't want to take the time to go and register. And so let's talk about why we believe it's important to register. Well, at one time, and registration only began around 1900. And before that, some people might cast several votes. Kind of like how America's Got Talent does. Everybody can vote 10 times for their favorite contestant. And you had that happening in America. So it's going to prevent voter fraud. Also, a more recent concern is that we don't want people who are dead still voting. Somehow they're still registered, or someone is coming in and voting for them, maybe has their registration card. And so this will tie into the need for an ID card in a little bit, but that ties in with preventing voter fraud. Also, you want to ensure that a person meets the requirements to vote. And then they like to register so they can see any trends in voting. So all states except North Dakota have voter registration laws. You can see some states even you have to vote prior to the election more previous than here in Oklahoma, which is 2 weeks. You have to vote. You have to register to vote up to 30 days prior to the election. Now, in 1993, they passed a law where you can register when you go and get your new tags for your car, or you get a new driver's license. It used to be that you had to go to the county voter office, but now you can do it this way. Or you can go to places like the post office and get a form and send it in through the mail. If you move, you must change your voter registration. So if any of you, well, now, those of you that will be going to college next year, you can still stay registered, and you guys are both in LaFleur County, right? So you can stay registered in LaFleur County and send it in absentee ballot. That's what our son did last year when he was at Oklahoma State. So registration, even though it's a good thing, a lot of people don't make the effort to register. And the United States is different than many democracies because it's the responsibility of the individual to register. In some countries, the government will register you. But we are a country that loves individual liberty, and so it's our responsibility to register. So now, I think it's on I know here in Oklahoma you have to present your voter ID card or a driver's license, but it's not mandatory in all states. They're wanting to make that a requirement in all states, that you present some kind of an ID, photo ID, or a voter registration card to be able to vote. I personally think that's a good idea. How do you guys feel about that? Now there is the argument that, and this comes more from the left, that conservatives are trying to weed out lower income people who will not register or who may not have a driver's license. But I don't think that's a valid argument. I believe conservatives are more concerned with like illegal aliens voting, or again, and my understanding was that in Arkansas there was a county where there were several dead people still on the registration rolls of a certain county during the 2016 election. I didn't ever check to verify that, but that's something that they want to eliminate as well. So another reason why we have a lower turnout of voters than other countries, other democracies, is this one right here. We hold more elections than any other democracy. And so this is a part of efforts to improve voter turnout, have fewer elections. Because we have a presidential election every 4 years, and then in between the presidential elections on the even years, we have a state election. And every 4 years we vote for a governor, and every 2 years we vote for our state reps and U.S. reps. And then every 6 years we vote for our senators. Excuse me. And then, as you all know, during odd years, a lot of your local communities will have their elections: sheriff, district or county commissioners, district judge, district attorney. So we are used to elections pretty much every year. November rolls around or October rolls around, and the Tulsa news channels are talking about upcoming elections, and I'm like, I look at my wife and I say, who's voting? What are we voting for? And a lot of times it's not us, it's maybe Tulsa County or somebody else is having an election. So we have a lot of elections. So, any questions on why we have a lower turnout? You don't have to know all of these things, but some of the things that have been suggested: have voting on weekends instead of Tuesdays, allow people to vote at home on the internet. Here's something: if you vote, you'll get a tax credit. Some people talk about making voting a law. So those are some suggestions to improve voter turnout. Now this here shows this was an interesting demographic. The percentage of eligible voters who have voted in presidential elections all the way back to George Washington to Donald Trump. Now, you can see in the first 30 years or so, actually, let me go up to right about there. The first 40 years, it was usually around 40% or less of the eligible voters. And the reason being was, one of the reasons was they were coming out of the British system of government where you had the elites, the wealthy landowners, the noblemen. They were the ones who ruled the country. And even if they were elected by common people, they were not required to vote how the people wanted them to. They functioned more as a, the word I'm trying to think of is not a representative, but they functioned more as a trustee. They would be elected by their community, and then they would go to Parliament in London and they would vote as they felt was best. And so that kind of thinking still affected the early republic, because you had Washington and Jefferson and Madison, and many of our early presidents were plantation landowners, wealthy. They were gentry. They were scared of the concept of democracy. Remember that? It was a bad word to them. So And then after the election of Andrew Jackson, 1832, Andrew Jackson, he fashioned himself as a people's president. You started seeing more participation, and it continued. And then, from about 1840 election to the 1900 election, so a 60-year period, you had, I would say the average would probably be around 75% of eligible voters voting. And then it started to dip down. And then since about the Great Depression, it's kind of gone up and down at times. And then for the last few years, it's been about 60%. Compared to other democracies, you can see. Now, I think the election of 2016, Trump versus Clinton, was about 60%. So that would be in comparison to Belgium. 87% of their eligible voters vote. And you have 4 countries here that are in the 80 percentiles. So you have several that are ahead of the United States. So why do some Americans vote and some do not? Our textbook brings out 4 main reasons. One is education level. Notice that on this graph here, I'll make this bigger too. So those who have less than a high school degree, actually they don't even have a diploma, they did not finish high school. About 50% of registered voters who do not have a high school diploma vote. And then you can see it just incrementally goes up. Those that have a high school diploma or a GED, a 64%. Those that have some college, maybe even an associate's degree, 75%. Those who get a 4-year degree, 81%. And those who go on to a master's or a doctorate, 85% of registered voters who have an advanced degree vote. Another factor is income. And the statistics show that the poorer someone is in America who is eligible to vote, the less likely they are to vote. People who make $100,000 or more a year, 9 out of 10 of them vote. People who make less than $20,000 a year, 5 out of 10. So income, education. Another factor is age. Here it is right here. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote if you're 18 years old. 18 to 24-year-olds, less than 50% of them vote, compared to almost 70% of people over 75 years old. Here's some other things that you won't need to know, but people who are married tend to vote more than people who are never married or who have gotten a divorce. Those who are unemployed are less likely to vote than those who are employed. So These slides will all be on your homepage today, but you can see this is why young people don't vote. The number one reason is they're too busy, or they didn't get out of work on time on that Tuesday. Another reason is maybe you were raised, how many of you would say that you were raised in a home where you had very active parents politically? Very active, and what I mean by that is they would vote pretty much every time they had a chance, and they would kind of keep up with issues. Anybody? Very active parents?
No.
Mildly active.
Mildly active. Anybody else that maybe they vote maybe on the big elections, governor, president?
Probably just the president.
Just the president.
Okay.
The grandparents.
Anybody have parents that watches the debates?
My grandparents do, but they don't
Okay.
care that much.
So that's the fourth factor why some Americans vote and some don't. Did they get an interest because they learned it from their parents, their grandparents, or maybe their parents or grandparents had a strong identification with a certain party? Anybody have a relative who would call themselves a yellow dog Democrat? That means they would vote Democrat even if the Democrat was the Antichrist. Seriously, I mean, it doesn't matter who the person is. That's a yellow dog Democrat. And I'm sure, I don't know what the term is for Republicans, but you would have some on that side too. So, all right, I'm going to put these slides up with today's lecture video. The new discussion is up along with, actually, I don't have the details for your report, but you will have a chance for some bonus because we're in luck. This Thursday is a debate between the Democratic candidates. And so I'll explain to you Wednesday how you can earn extra credit and have some fun with that. But any questions before we call it a day?
Oh, Mr. Banks, we don't have,
Yes.
Panama doesn't have school on Friday.
Panama is out of school?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
on Friday.
So we will not have school on Friday then, unless Arcoma, is it okay with you if we take that day off?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we'll see you Wednesday.
See ya.
My phone's at like 70%.